When the Henry County Courthouse burned in 1865, most believed the fire had consumed nothing more than Confederate debt ledgers and old legal records. But courthouse clerk Josiah Pitton wrote something chilling in his private diary. That among the ashes, workers uncovered a locked iron chest containing 23 pages of testimony so horrifying that the Reconstruction authorities ordered every copy destroyed. Those pages belonged to a woman known only as the Silent Giant, a former slave woman who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall and had not spoken a single word in 18 years. Her silence finally broke on March 14, 1863, when a Union surgeon examined her in a contraband camp outside Richmond. What she whispered to him about her master and her 9 daughters was so unbearable that 3 witnesses vomited on the spot, and the surgeon himself requested immediate transfer to frontline duty rather than record what he had heard. The military buried her story. The surgeon died of typhoid 6 weeks later, and the Silent Giant vanished from every official record. But fragments of her story survived, hidden in private letters, old diaries, and the nightmares of those who heard even a portion of it. Before we continue with the haunting tale of the woman they called Big Sarah and the plantation that devoured her children, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and comment below what state or country you're listening from. Your voice keeps these forgotten stories alive. Now let us return to the year 1831, to Greenbrier Plantation, where silence became the only mercy left. The woman who would become known as Big Sarah arrived at Greenbrier Plantation in Powhatan County, Virginia, on an August morning that same week Nat Turner's rebellion began 70 miles to the southeast. Greenbrier stretched over 2,000 acres of tobacco land along the James River, far enough from Richmond to feel isolated, yet close enough for its owner, Nathaniel Crowther, to keep one foot in the city's powerful merchant circles. The plantation house was an imposing 3-story red brick mansion. Its white columns and Greek Revival ate a reflection of the arrogance and ambition of Virginia's planter elite. Behind it, 12 slave cabins stood in a perfect line, each one packed with 6 to 10 people, living under conditions so cruel that even by the standards of 1831, whispers of Crowther's brutality spread through neighboring counties. Crowther had inherited Greenbrier in 1824 along with crushing debts. By the time he turned 31, he had clawed his way back to wealth, not through innovation, but through what he called strategic breeding programs. It was his polite term for one of the most disturbing practices of the pre-war South, the forced breeding of enslaved people to increase his human stock. His wife, Constance, had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, leaving him bitter, childless, and obsessed with rebuilding his name among the Tidewater aristocracy. That August, the slave trader Vernon Caldwell from Charleston arrived with a woman unlike any the Greenbrier slaves had ever seen. She stood well over 6 feet tall, her shoulders broad, her hands enormous, the kind of strength that made men step aside without realizing why. Caldwell claimed she was 22, born on a rice plantation in the South Carolina Low Country. He sold her for $800, a fortune, boasting of her exceptional breeding potential. Her name, he said, was Sarah. When Crowther asked why she didn't speak, Caldwell's tone changed. She used to, he said quietly, until the day she watched what they did to her mother. Since then, not a word, not to anyone, white or black. Crowther studied her like a farmer inspecting livestock. He had her walk, turn, lift her arms. Her gaze never met his. She moved like someone hollowed out from the inside, eyes fixed on nothing, expression unreadable. Her silence didn't trouble him. If anything, it pleased him, because silence could not rebel. What Crowther did not tell the trader, or anyone, was that this woman was exactly what he had been looking for. In her height, he saw a foundation for a new generation of laborers. In her silence, he saw obedience. And in her brokenness, he saw control. Among the enslaved, whispers began almost immediately. An elder named Bess, who served as the matriarch of the quarters, later said she knew something was wrong with Sarah, not in her mind, but in her soul. "I seen that look before," she said. "That's the look of somebody who done seen the devil and lived." For 2 weeks, Sarah worked the tobacco fields. Then Crowther ordered her moved to a small storage cabin, isolated from the others. He told the overseer, Virgil Stanton, that she needed special management. Stanton, a man paid not to ask questions, nodded and obeyed. Then came the night of the new moon, September 1831. Crowther walked to her cabin carrying a lantern, a bottle of whiskey, and a leather strap. He stayed inside for 2 hours. When he emerged, his shirt was torn, his knuckles bleeding. but his face wore the calm satisfaction of a man who believed he had conquered something. The next morning, he told Stanton that Sarah had accepted her new role. From that night forward, she would work the fields by day, but her nights belonged to him alone. The other slaves knew what this meant. They had seen it happen before, though never with such calculated deliberation. Bess tried once to approach Sarah during the lunch break in the fields to offer some word of comfort or solidarity, but Sarah simply stared through her as if she were made of glass. Her silence was absolute. When Bess touched her arm, Sarah flinched so violently that she dropped her water gourd, but she made no sound, not a gasp, not a cry, nothing. By December of 1831, the first signs of Sarah's pregnancy became visible. Crowther recorded the date in his journal with evident satisfaction, noting her measurements and estimating that the child would be born in late spring. He began to feed her better than the other slaves, more meat, more vegetables, milk from the plantation's dairy. He wanted to ensure, he told Stanton, that the child would be healthy and strong. He had plans for this child and for all the children that would follow. The other slaves watched as Sarah's belly grew through the winter months. They saw how Crowther visited her cabin every few nights, how he sometimes brought cloth or small gifts that he presented to her as if she were a prized mare in his stable. They saw how Sarah's silence deepened, how she moved through the world like a ghost in a body too large to hide. Some of the women tried to help her when they could, leaving extra food near her cabin, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement when they passed in the fields, but Sarah never responded. Her eyes remained fixed on that distant, unreachable point, and her lips stayed sealed as if they had been sewn shut. Bess would later tell her granddaughter that she could feel something dark gathering over Greenbrier that winter. The air felt heavier than it should, she said, and birds seemed to avoid the area around Sarah's cabin. Bess did not believe in curses or haunts in the traditional sense, but she believed in evil, the human kind that needed no supernatural explanation. And she believed that Nathaniel Crowther was bringing something terrible into being, something that would not be satisfied until it had consumed everything in its path. Sarah's first child was born on May 3rd, 1832, during a thunderstorm so violent that the oldest slaves claimed it was the worst they had seen in 20 years. The midwife, a skilled woman named Patience who had delivered hundreds of babies on various plantations, later told Bess that the birth itself was unremarkable. The baby was large and healthy, a girl with her mother's height already evident in her long limbs. What disturbed Patience was Sarah's complete silence throughout the labor. Most women screamed, cried, cursed, or prayed. Sarah made no sound at all. She stared at the ceiling beams of her cabin, tears streaming down her face, but her mouth remained closed. When Patience placed the baby in her arms, Sarah looked at the child with an expression that Patience would describe years later as the saddest thing I ever witnessed, ever. It was not the sadness of exhaustion or pain, but something deeper, a grief that seemed to know the future. Crowther named the child Delilah and recorded her birth in his journal with meticulous detail, ALB 3022 in long. Perfect specimens, he wrote, both mother and daughter. He visited the cabin the next day with a small silver rattle, an object that seemed grotesquely out of place in the sparse, dirt-floored room. He placed it in the baby's hand and smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose investment was paying dividends. Sarah watched him with those empty eyes, holding her daughter close, and said nothing. For the first year of Delilah's life, Sarah was allowed to keep the child with her. Crowther believed, based on his readings about animal breeding, that the mother's milk and care in the early months would strengthen the child's constitution. He continued to visit Sarah's cabin regularly, and by the time Delilah turned 8 months old, Sarah was pregnant again. The pattern had been established. Crowther had no intention of stopping. The second child, Rebecca, was born in March of 1833. The third, Judith, arrived in November of that same year. The fourth, Ruth, came in July of 1834. Each pregnancy followed the same ritual: Crowther's visits, Sarah's silence, the birth attended by Patience, and the careful documentation in Crowther's journal. Each time Sarah held her newborn daughter with that same expression of unbearable sadness, and each time she remained silent. The other slaves began to understand the full scope of Crowther's design. He was not simply taking Sarah as a concubine, as many slaveholders did. He was systematically breeding her, treating her as livestock with the explicit goal of producing as many children as possible, and every single child was a girl. This was not by chance, the older slaves whispered, but by design. Crowther wanted daughters because daughters could be bred in turn. He was planning generations ahead, building what he called his improved line. By 1836, Sarah had given birth to 6 daughters: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi. All of them showed signs of their mother's unusual height. Delilah, at 4 years old, was already as tall as a typical 6-year-old. Crowther was delighted. He had begun to separate the older girls from their mother, assigning them to work in the main house where he could observe their development more closely. He told Stanton that he wanted them to learn domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing, so that they would be more valuable when the time came. But those who worked in the house saw how Crowther watched these little girls, how his eyes followed them with the same calculating assessment he had once directed at their mother. The female house slaves began to fear what would happen when these girls reached adolescence. Sarah saw her daughters less and less as they grew older. Crowther had decided that limiting contact between mother and children would prevent Sarah from teaching them any ideas about resistance or escape. He wanted the daughters to see their situation as natural, inevitable. He wanted them compliant and ignorant like their mother appeared to be. What Crowther did not understand, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing, was that Sarah's silence was not compliance. It was calculation. In late 1836, 2 events occurred that would set in motion the tragedy that still haunts Powhatan County. The first was that Crowther hired a new overseer. Virgil Stanton had died in August of that year, kicked in the head by a mule in what everyone agreed was a fitting end for a cruel man. His replacement was a younger man named Edmund Yancey, recently arrived from North Carolina. Yancey was efficient and brutal, but unlike Stanton, he was also curious. He noticed things. He kept his own records, and he began to wonder about the tall, silent woman in the isolated cabin and the growing number of light-skinned girls who all bore a striking resemblance to their master. The second event was that Sarah became pregnant for the 7th time, but this pregnancy was different from the others. By the end of her 2nd trimester, it became clear that she was carrying twins. Patients examining her in the cabin felt 2 distinct heads and told Crowther that he could expect 2 more daughters by spring. Crowther's excitement was almost childish. Twins meant his breeding program was even more successful than he had hoped. He doubled Sarah's food rations and forbade her from any field work. She was too valuable now to risk. The twins, Hannah and Abigail, were born on March 22, 1837. Both survived. Both were healthy, and both were girls. Crowther now had 8 daughters from Sarah, ranging in age from 5-year-old Delilah to newborns Hannah and Abigail. In his journal, he calculated that if the pattern continued, Sarah could produce at least 6 more children before her childbearing years ended. He had already begun to plan for Delilah's future. She would turn 12 in 1839. By 13 or 14, she could begin bearing children herself. The cycle would continue, expanding exponentially, creating a dynasty of slaves who would make Greenbrier the most prosperous plantation in Powhatan County. But something had changed in Sarah after the twins were born. Patients noticed it first. Sarah had always been silent, but now there was something different in her eyes, not emptiness, but intensity. She watched her newborn daughters with an expression that was no longer simply sad. It was focused, determined. For the first time in 6 years, patients saw Sarah's jaw clench with what looked like rage. On a cold night in November of 1837, 6 months after the twins' birth, screams erupted from the main house. The slaves in the quarters heard Crowther shouting, then the sound of something heavy crashing. Yancey emerged from his cabin with a pistol and ran toward the house. What he found inside would become the subject of whispered speculation for decades to come, though the official record would say almost nothing about it. 5-year-old Delilah was cowering in a corner of Crowther's study, her dress torn. Crowther himself was bleeding from a wound on his head caused by a brass candlestick that lay on the floor. And standing in the doorway, silent as always, but with her massive frame blocking any exit, was Sarah. In her hand, she held a kitchen knife. She had somehow left her locked cabin, made her way to the main house, and found her daughter in Crowther's study. What exactly she had witnessed was never officially recorded, but the implications were clear to everyone present. Yancey raised his pistol, aiming at Sarah's chest. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sarah did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Crowther for the first time since her arrival at Greenbrier 6 years earlier. She looked at him with an expression of such profound hatred that Yancey later told his wife it made his blood run cold. And then, still holding the knife, She turned and walked out of the house. She did not run. She simply walked with that same mechanical gait back toward her cabin. Crowther, wiping blood from his face, screamed at Yancey to shoot her. But Yancey hesitated. Something in Sarah's deliberate, calm departure had unnerved him. She was not fleeing like someone who feared punishment. She was withdrawing like someone who had accomplished exactly what she intended. Before Yancey could make a decision, Sarah had disappeared into the darkness. They found her the next morning, sitting in her cabin with her 9th daughter, a newborn she had delivered by herself during the night. No one had even known she was pregnant again. The baby, whom Crowther would name Miriam, was small but alive. Sarah sat holding her, dried blood on her thighs, the kitchen knife placed deliberately on the floor in front of her. She stared straight ahead, silent as always, waiting for whatever would come next. Crowther was faced with a dilemma. By law and custom, Sarah's attack on a white man, even in defense of her daughter, was a capital offense. He could have her hanged or sold away, but doing so would mean losing his breeding program, his improved line, and the fortune he believed these children represented. After a week of deliberation, he made his decision. Sarah would be punished, but not killed. She would be locked in her cabin permanently, let out only for necessary physical maintenance. She would no longer see her daughters at all. And to ensure she could never attack anyone again, Crowther had a blacksmith forge an iron collar that would remain around her neck permanently, attached to a chain bolted to the wall of her cabin. The chain was long enough that she could move around the small space, but not long enough to reach the door. The other slaves watched in horror as this sentence was carried out. Bess wept openly, which earned her 10 lashes from Yancey. The house slaves who had cared for Sarah's daughters were forbidden from speaking about what had happened. And Edmund Yancey, who had seen something in that moment in Crowther's study that he could not quite articulate, began to keep a secret journal of his own, a record of observations that would prove crucial years later. Sarah's punishment began in December of 1837. For the next 4 years, she lived in that cabin, chained like an animal, visited only by Crowther for his purposes and by patients when births required medical attention. She gave birth to her 9th daughter in that first year of captivity. She never saw Delilah again. She never held Rebecca or Judith or any of her other children. And she never ever spoke. But silence, as Bess had understood years earlier, can be a weapon, and Sarah was sharpening hers with every passing day. The years between 1837 and 1845 transformed Greenbrier Plantation into something that even neighboring slaveholders found disturbing. Crowther's obsession with his breeding program had evolved into a mania that consumed his every waking thought. He had converted 2 rooms of the main house into what he called his study of human husbandry, filling them with charts, measurements, and daguerreotype images of Sarah's daughters at various ages. He corresponded with agricultural societies and even some medical professionals, though he was careful to phrase his inquiries in abstract terms that did not reveal the full scope of his experiments. The daughters themselves grew in their separate spheres, each one developing under Crowther's watchful eye. Delilah, the eldest, turned 13 in 1845. She had inherited her mother's height and was nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of striking appearance that drew attention wherever she went. Crowther had trained her in household management and had begun introducing her to visitors as his ward, a fiction that fooled no one but satisfied his need for social respectability. What happened in the private hours between Crowther and Delilah was known only to the house slaves who changed the sheets and heard the sounds that echoed through the corridors at night. Rebecca, Judith, and Ruth worked in the house as well, learning skills that Crowther claimed would make them valuable as skilled slaves. Esther and Naomi, slightly younger, helped in the kitchen under the supervision of the cook, an elderly woman named Dinah, who treated the girls with a gentleness that bordered on defiance. The youngest 3, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, still lived in the slave quarters, though Crowther had them brought to the main house regularly for what he called inspections. Throughout these years, Sarah remained chained in her cabin. The other slaves rarely saw her. Crowther had the cabin's windows boarded up from the outside, supposedly to prevent her from signaling to others, but the real reason seemed to be that he wanted her existence erased from view. Food was left at her door twice a day. Once a week, she was allowed outside, still chained, to walk in a small fenced area behind her cabin. During these brief moments of semi-freedom, the other slaves would sometimes catch glimpses of her. They reported that she had changed. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her body, though still massive, had taken on a gauntness that suggested inadequate nutrition despite Crowther's claims of proper care. But her eyes, those who dared to look into them, said her eyes had become something else entirely, not empty anymore, but burning. Edmund Yancey continued to keep his secret journal during these years, documenting observations that troubled him increasingly. He noted the ages of the daughters and the timing of when Crowther's nocturnal visits to their rooms began. He recorded the tears he saw on Delilah's face at breakfast the morning after her 13th birthday, and the way Rebecca flinched when Crowther touched her shoulder when she turned 12. Yancey was no abolitionist. He believed in slavery and enforced it brutally, but he found himself repulsed by what he was witnessing. There was slavery, and then there was this. Even he could see the difference. In September of 1845, a Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Sheffield visited Greenbrier as part of his rounds through Powhatan County. Crowther was not a particularly religious man, but he maintained appearances for social standing, and he allowed Sheffield to preach to the slaves on Sunday afternoons. Sheffield was a thin, intense man in his 40s, genuinely committed to spreading the gospel, even to those in bondage. Unlike many white preachers of the era, he actually seemed to care about the spiritual welfare of enslaved people, though his understanding of justice was limited by the blinders of his time and place. During his visit, Sheffield noticed the unusual number of mixed-race girls at Greenbrier, all bearing a striking resemblance to each other. He commented on this to Crowther, who explained with barely concealed pride that these were the daughters of a particular slave woman who possessed exceptional breeding qualities. Sheffield's expression darkened. He asked if he might speak with this woman to provide spiritual counsel. Crowther refused, claiming she was unwell and could not receive visitors. Something in his refusal made Sheffield suspicious. That evening, Sheffield spoke quietly with some of the older slaves, including Bess. What she told him carefully, knowing the danger of speaking too freely to any white man, horrified him. She did not mention Crowther's sexual violence explicitly, but she spoke of Sarah's chains, her isolation, and the sorrow that hung over the plantation like a fog. She mentioned that Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, that she had been separated from her 9 daughters, that she lived in darkness. Sheffield understood enough to grasp the full picture. The next morning, before leaving Greenbrier, Sheffield confronted Crowther directly. It was a brave act, possibly foolish, for a circuit preacher with no wealth or power. He told Crowther that what he was doing was an abomination before God, that no amount of property rights could justify such treatment of a human being, that even within the institution of slavery, there were lines that should not be crossed. Crowther listened with an expression of cold amusement, then informed Sheffield that he was no longer welcome at Greenbrier. If Sheffield made any public accusations, Crowther warned he would sue him for defamation and use his considerable influence to have Sheffield removed from the Methodist ministry. Sheffield left shaken and angry, but ultimately powerless. However, Sheffield did something that would prove significant later. He wrote a detailed letter to his bishop describing what he had witnessed at Greenbrier without naming Crowther directly. He also sent a copy to a fellow minister in Richmond who had expressed sympathy with the more reformed-minded elements of the Methodist Church. These letters would sit in church archives forgotten until the Civil War brought them back to light. In December of 1845, something changed in Sarah's cabin. Patients who still attended to Sarah's medical needs noticed it. During a routine visit, Sarah had begun scratching marks on the walls, lines arranged in groups of 5 like a prisoner counting days. But these marks did not seem to be counting time linearly. Instead, they were arranged in 9 columns, each column containing a different number of marks. When patients looked more closely, she realized with a chill that each column corresponded to one of Sarah's daughters. Sarah was tracking them, tracking their ages, counting. Patients said nothing to Crowther about this discovery, but that night, lying in her own bed in the slave quarters, she found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about those marks on the wall, the methodical precision of them, the organization. Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, but she was not silent in her mind. She was remembering, she was planning, and somehow Patience knew that whatever Sarah was planning would be terrible. The spring of 1846 brought changes to Greenbrier that would accelerate the coming disaster. Crowther, now 53 years old and increasingly confident in his breeding program's success, decided to expand his operations. He purchased 3 more slave women, specifically selected for their height and physical strength, intending to replicate his success with Sarah. He also constructed 3 new cabins near Sarah's, each designed with the same isolation features: boarded windows, reinforced doors, and iron rings embedded in the floor for chains. The other slaves watched these preparations with growing dread. They understood what Crowther intended, and they knew that Sarah's fate would be replicated 3 times over. But Crowther had become sloppy in his confidence. He spent more time in Richmond, socializing with other planters, and even presenting a paper to an agricultural society about improved breeding techniques for the labor force. That was abstract enough to be respectable, but specific enough that some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. During his absences, the day-to-day management of Greenbrier fell increasingly to Edmund Yancey, whose private disgust with Crowther's methods had matured into something resembling a crisis of conscience. Yancey had never considered himself a moral man. He had whipped slaves, separated families, and enforced the brutal discipline that kept the plantation running. But Crowther's systematic sexual exploitation of Sarah and his daughters crossed a line that even Yancey found intolerable. It was not that Yancey believed slavery was wrong, he did not. But he believed that even within that evil institution, there were rules, boundaries, traditions that separated civilization from savagery. Crowther had abandoned all of that in pursuit of his obsession. In April of 1846, Yancey did something that would have gotten him killed if Crowther had discovered it. He unlocked Sarah's cabin door one afternoon while Crowther was in Richmond and stood at the threshold, not entering but looking inside. Sarah sat on her straw mattress, the iron collar around her neck, the chain stretching to the wall. She looked at him with those burning eyes, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Yancey spoke. He said, "I know what he has done to you. I know what he is doing to your daughters. I cannot stop him. But I want you to know that someone sees it. Someone knows." Sarah stared at him, her expression unchanging. Then slowly she raised her hand and pointed toward the wall where she had scratched her marks. The 9 columns representing her 9 daughters. Yancey looked at those marks and understood. She was not asking for sympathy. She was making sure he knew she was counting. Making sure someone would remember when the time came how many there were, how many had been violated, how many had been stolen from her. Yancey nodded, locked the door, and walked away feeling like he had just witnessed something that would haunt him until his death. That summer, Delilah became pregnant. She was 14 years old. The father was obviously Crowther, though he never acknowledged this publicly. The house slaves watched her belly grow with a mixture of pity and horror, understanding that Crowther's plan had entered its next phase. He was breeding the 2nd generation now. His improved line was expanding exactly as he had designed it. When Denina, the elderly cook, tried to comfort Delilah one evening in the kitchen, the girl broke down sobbing. She whispered through her tears that she wanted to die, that she had tried to throw herself down the stairs, but Rebecca had stopped her, that she could not bear what was happening to her. Denina held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. There were no words adequate to this particular kind of suffering. In September, something extraordinary happened. A slave named Josiah, who worked in the stables, was making repairs to Sarah's cabin when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a voice, low, rough from disuse, but unmistakably human. Sarah was speaking not to him, not to anyone present, but to herself. She was reciting names: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, Miriam, over and over like a prayer or an incantation. Josiah finished his repairs quickly and left without saying anything, but he told Bess what he had heard. Bess's blood ran cold. Sarah had been silent for 15 years, and now she was speaking again, speaking her daughters' names in the darkness of her prison. It felt like something was awakening. Something that had been waiting a very long time. October brought tragedy and revelation in equal measure. Rebecca, who was 12 years old, tried to run away. She made it 15 me before slave catchers found her hiding in a barn. They brought her back to Greenbrier in chains, and Crowther had her whipped in front of all the other slaves as an example. 20 lashes methodically applied by Yancey, who later wrote in his journal that it was the worst thing he had ever done. Rebecca screamed through the first 10 lashes, then went silent for the last 10, her mind retreating to wherever people go when the body can no longer protect them. When it was over, Crowther announced that Rebecca would be sold away within the week. He had decided she was a bad influence on her sisters. This announcement caused something unexpected to happen. Delilah, her belly now visibly swollen with Crowther's child, stepped forward and spoke in front of everyone. She said, "You cannot sell her. She is my sister. If you sell her, I will tell everyone in Richmond what you have done to us. I will stand on a street corner and tell everyone who will listen." The slaves held their breath. No one spoke to Crowther this way. Certainly no slave, and especially not a pregnant 14-year-old girl. Crowther's face turned purple with rage. He stepped toward Delilah, raising his hand to strike her, but then he stopped. He looked at her pregnant belly, his investment, his future profits, and lowered his hand. He said through gritted teeth that Rebecca would not be sold, but she would spend the next month in the root cellar, beneath the kitchen with minimal food and water to contemplate her sins. Delilah had won a small victory, but everyone present understood it would not be forgotten. That night, Yancey broke his own rules again. He went to Sarah's cabin and, speaking through the door, told her what had happened with Delilah and Rebecca. He told her that Delilah was pregnant. He told her that Rebecca had tried to escape. He did not know why he felt compelled to do this. Perhaps because Sarah had no other way of knowing what was happening to her daughters. Perhaps because he felt she had a right to know. Or perhaps because he needed someone to understand the full scope of what was unfolding. When he finished speaking, there was silence. Then from inside the cabin, he heard Sarah's voice for the first time. It was deeper than he expected, roughened by years of disuse. She said only 3 words, "They are mine." Yancey felt ice run down his spine. He understood that Sarah was not speaking of possession, but of identity. Those girls were hers. They came from her body. And what was happening to them was happening to her. He walked away from the cabin feeling certain that something terrible was building, some storm that had been gathering for 15 years, and that when it finally broke, it would destroy everything in its path. November of 1846 marked 15 years since Sarah's arrival at Greenbrier. During those 15 years, she had given birth to 9 daughters. She had been raped hundreds of times. She had been chained like an animal for 9 years. She had watched her eldest daughter follow her into the same nightmare. And through all of it, she had maintained her silence, not from compliance or defeat, but from something else entirely, something patient, something that knew how to wait. Just when we thought we understood the full horror of what was happening at Greenbrier, the situation intensifies in ways that will shock even those familiar with the darkest chapters of American history. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens when Sarah's silence finally breaks. On December 1st, 1846, Delilah gave birth to a son. It was the first male child born from Crowther's breeding program, and his excitement was almost manic. He named the boy Nathaniel Ginger and announced to the house slaves that this child represented the future of Greenbrier. A son meant continuity, legitimacy in his twisted mind. He could claim the boy as his heir, though everyone knew the truth about his parentage. What Crowther did not anticipate was Delilah's reaction to her son. The moment she held the infant, something shifted in her. The house slaves saw it, a hardening around her eyes, a straightening of her spine despite her exhaustion. She looked at this baby boy born from violence and exploitation, and made a decision that would echo through the coming months. She refused to nurse him. When Crowther demanded she feed the child, she turned her face to the wall and said nothing. They brought in a wet nurse, another enslaved woman named Flora. But Delilah's rejection of her own son created a tension in the household that everyone could feel. Yancey noted in his journal that Delilah seemed to be following her mother's example of strategic silence. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, moved through the house like a shadow, and kept her eyes down except when she thought no one was watching. In those unguarded moments, Yancey caught expressions on her face that reminded him disturbingly of Sarah. That same burning intensity, that same sense of someone counting, calculating, waiting. The winter of 1847 was brutal. Snow fell early and stayed late, trapping everyone at Greenbrier for weeks at a time. The isolation seemed to amplify the darkness that had settled over the plantation. Crowther spent more time in the main house, drinking heavily, obsessively, checking on his daughters and documenting their development in his journals. He had begun to turn his attention to 13-year-old Judith, and the house slaves knew what that meant. The cycle was continuing, expanding, consuming. In February, something happened that would prove to be a turning point. Rebecca, who had spent her month in the root cellar the previous fall and emerged changed, quieter, harder, was caught teaching some of the younger slaves to read using a stolen Bible. Literacy among slaves was illegal in Virginia, and teaching reading was considered a dangerous subversion. Crowther was furious. He had Rebecca whipped again 10 lashes this time. But even through the punishment, she remained silent. When it was over, she looked at Crowther with an expression of such pure contempt that he actually stepped backward. That night, Yancey made his most dangerous decision yet. He went to Sarah's cabin with a lantern and unlocked the door. He stepped inside for the first time since her imprisonment began 9 years earlier. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed body, waste, despair. Sarah sat in the corner, the chain attached to her iron collar, her gray hair hanging in matted clumps. But when she raised her eyes to look at him, Yancey saw intelligence there, focus, purpose. He told her everything. He told her about Delilah's baby, about Rebecca's whipping, about Judith's future. He told her that Crowther planned to start breeding the younger daughters as soon as they reached puberty. He told her that the new cabins were ready for the 3 new women Crowther had purchased. He told her that the evil was expanding, multiplying, and that he did not know how to stop it, but felt she deserved to know. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice rough but clear. How long until spring? The question startled Yancey. He said it was February, so perhaps 2 months. Sarah nodded slowly. Then she asked, where do they keep the keys? Yancey understood immediately what she was asking. The keys to all the chains, all the locks, all the cabins. He told her they hung in Crowther's study on a hook behind his desk. Sarah absorbed this information, then said, go now. Do not come back. When it happens, say you knew nothing. Yancey wanted to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He left the cabin, locked the door, and returned to his own quarters, feeling like he had just set something irreversible in motion. March brought warmer weather and increased activity at Greenbrier. Crowther announced he would be hosting a gathering of neighboring planters. In April, a social event designed to show off his success and rebuild his standing among the Tidewater elite. He wanted Greenbrier to look prosperous, orderly, civilized. He had the house slaves working constantly to prepare, and he made plans to display his improved stock, meaning Sarah's daughters, as examples of his breeding program success. The daughters themselves understood what this meant. They would be paraded before other white men evaluated like livestock, their future fates sealed. During these preparations, strange things began to happen. Tools went missing from the workshop. A section of fence near Sarah's cabin collapsed for no apparent reason. The lock on the smokehouse was found broken one morning, though nothing seemed to have been stolen. Yancey investigated these incidents, but could find no explanation. The other slaves claimed ignorance, but he noticed they seemed tense, expectant, as if waiting for something. On March 15, 1847, Patience was called to Sarah's cabin for what Crowther described as a routine medical check. When Patience entered the cabin, she found Sarah sitting calmly on her mattress, the chain pulled beside her. She had somehow removed the iron collar from her neck. The metal was bent, twisted by sheer force until the lock mechanism had broken. Patience stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Sarah's neck where the collar had left deep scars. Sarah looked at her and said, tell him nothing. Tell him I was sick and you gave me medicine. Tell him I am weak. Patience, terrified, but also moved by something she saw in Sarah's eyes, nodded and backed out of the cabin. She reported to Crowther exactly what Sarah had instructed, adding that Sarah seemed to be suffering from a fever and should not be disturbed. Crowther, preoccupied with his party preparations, accepted this report without question. What Patience did not tell anyone was what else she had seen in that cabin. Scratched into the wall in 9 columns were the names of Sarah's daughters, and beneath each name was a series of marks, counts of something Patience did not fully understand. But the pattern was clear. Sarah had been tracking not just her daughters' ages, but their menstrual cycles. She knew with precision which of her daughters was currently fertile, and she knew when Crowther would likely visit their rooms. She had been documenting his patterns for years, counting the days between his assaults, predicting his movements with the accuracy of someone who had studied her enemy with absolute focus. The week before Crowther's planned gathering, Yancey noticed that Sarah's cabin had gone completely silent. No sounds came from within. The food left at her door remained untouched. He reported this to Crowther, who seemed annoyed rather than concerned. Crowther said Sarah was probably being dramatic and that she would eat when she got hungry enough. He instructed Yancey to leave her alone until after the party. He did not want any disruptions. But Sarah was not being dramatic. She was preparing. During those days of apparent silence, she had been systematically weakening the boards of her cabin's back wall, working at them with patient, methodical determination. She had been testing the weight of her chain, calculating how it could be used as a weapon. She had been listening to the sounds of the plantation, learning the rhythms of who walked where and when, and she had been thinking about her daughters, all 9 of them, and what she needed to do to save them from her fate. April 3, 1847, dawned clear and warm. Crowther's gathering was scheduled for that evening, and the plantation buzzed with final preparations. 20 planters from across Powhatan and surrounding counties would be arriving along with their wives and older sons. Crowther had arranged for a lavish dinner, entertainment, and a tour of his facilities where he planned to present his theories on agricultural improvement, his euphemism for his breeding program. The house slaves worked frantically all day. Denina and her helpers prepared an elaborate meal. Delilah, Rebecca, and the other older daughters were dressed in clean clothing and instructed to serve the guests. Crowther reminded them repeatedly to smile, to be pleasant, to demonstrate the docility and refinement that his program had produced. The girls moved through these preparations like sleepwalkers, their faces masks of forced compliance. At sunset, the guests began to arrive in their carriages. The sound of horses, laughter, and conversation filled the air. Crowther stood on the front steps of the main house, greeting each arrival with exaggerated warmth. The party moved inside, and soon the dining room echoed with the sounds of men discussing tobacco prices, politics, and the growing tensions over slavery that were beginning to fracture the nation. What none of them knew was that in her cabin, Sarah had finished her preparations. She had removed the weakened boards from the back wall, creating an opening just large enough for her massive frame to squeeze through. She had wrapped sections of her chain around her hands and forearms, turning it into both armor and weapon. And she had made a decision about what came next, a decision that had been forming for 16 years since the first night Crower had entered her cabin with his lantern and his leather strap. At precisely 1800, as dinner was being served and Crowder was standing to make a toast, Sarah emerged from her cabin. She moved through the darkness with surprising speed for someone who had been chained for 9 years, her body remembering freedom, even if her mind had never forgotten imprisonment. She made her way not toward the main house, but toward the quarters where her youngest daughters, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, slept. She entered the cabin silently, waking them with a hand over each girl's mouth. When they saw her, they did not scream. Despite years of separation, they knew her instantly. Some recognition deeper than memory told them this giant woman was their mother. Sarah did not speak to them. She simply gestured for them to follow, and they did. Climbing out of their beds and trailing behind her through the darkness, she led them away from the plantation buildings toward the treen that marked the edge of Crowther's property. There, hidden in the shadows, she had them wait. Then she turned back toward Greenbrier. The house slaves who witnessed what happened next would carry those memories to their graves, and their testimony would become the fragmented record that survived. Sarah entered the main house through the kitchen door, which had been left open due to the heat of cooking. She moved through the corridors with purpose, the chain still wrapped around her arms, making soft clicking sounds against the walls. When she reached Crowther's study, she found what she was looking for, the ring of keys hanging behind his desk, just as Yancey had described. With the keys in hand, Sarah moved to the upstairs bedrooms. She unlocked the doors where Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi slept. She woke each one, placed a finger to her lips for silence, and gestured for them to follow. The daughters, understanding instinctively that this was escape or death, or possibly both, followed without question. Sarah led them down the back stairs, through the kitchen, where Denina stood frozen with a ladle in her hand, and out into the night. It wasn't until Sarah and all 9 of her daughters were gone that someone inside the Greenbrier dining room noticed the silence. The usual clatter of dishes from the kitchen had stopped. The laughter and music from the party still filled the air, but the rhythm beneath it, the heartbeat of the house, had vanished. At first, Nathaniel Crowther thought little of it. He scowled at the delay, excused himself from his guests, and went to investigate. But when he entered the kitchen and found it completely empty, pots still boiling, food half prepared, his irritation turned to something colder. He shouted for Yancey, the overseer, who came running with several of the white men from the dining room. They searched the mansion, then the slave quarters, calling names, barking orders. Finally, someone thought to check Sarah's cabin. When they arrived, they found the back wall ripped open, the chain that had once bound her lying in a coil on the dirt floor, like the shed skin of something that had outgrown captivity. That was the moment panic took root. Crowther screamed for lanterns. Dogs were released, guns loaded, and within minutes a hunting party of 20 armed men thundered out into the Virginia night. They were determined to find the escaped slaves before they reached freedom, or worse, inspired others to do the same. But Sarah had planned this moment for years. She didn't lead her daughters north toward the routes everyone expected. Instead, she took them south and east toward the James River. She knew every inch of that terrain, where the current ran strong enough to hide scent, where paths twisted through swamp and shadow, where dogs would lose the trail. And she had something else, allies she had cultivated in silence. For months, she had used the sick and wounded traveling through the plantation as messengers, passing coded words she never spoke. Even without a voice, Sarah had built a network. By dawn, the hunters had found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of where the 9 women had gone. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Crowther was furious. His entire future, his reputation, his fortune, his breeding experiment was vanishing before his eyes. He offered a 500 reward, an enormous fortune in 1847, for any information that would bring them back. Slave catchers from 3 counties joined the search, but the days stretched into weeks. Nothing, and so the stories began. Some whispered that Sarah and her daughters had reached the Underground Railroad, and from there, freedom in Canada. Others claimed they perished in the wilderness, consumed by starvation and cold. But the darkest rumor said that Sarah, knowing capture was inevitable, had killed her own daughters, a mercy only a mother could understand. Yet one man claimed to have seen something different. Edmund Yancey, the overseer who had once helped hunt others, had begun to lose his stomach for cruelty. On the 3rd day of searching, while riding along the James River, he came upon a sight that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. On a small sandbar in the middle of the river, he saw 9 piles of stones, each topped with a crude wooden cross tied with twine. And standing waist deep in the current, her head barely above the water, was Sarah. Their eyes met across the river. Yancey didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shout for help. He simply sat there frozen as she slowly lowered herself beneath the surface, vanishing into the brown water without a sound. She never resurfaced. Yancey waited. He waited until the river was still. Then he turned his horse and rode back to Greenbrier. When Crowther demanded an update, Yancey lied. He said he had seen nothing. The search went on for another month, but no trace of Sarah or her daughters was ever found. The aftermath destroyed Nathaniel Crowther more completely than any rebellion could have. His breeding program became public knowledge when officials began asking about the missing women, all 9 nearly identical, all daughters of the same mother, and all resembling Crowther himself. Even among slaveholders, his acts were seen as monstrous. Neighbors cut ties. Business partners withdrew. Debts were called in. By the end of the year, Crowther sold Greenbrier Plantation for a fraction of its worth and moved to Richmond, where he descended into madness and drink. He told anyone who would listen that he could still hear footsteps in the dark, still see Sarah's face in the corners of mirrors. In 1852, he was found dead, alone in a rented room, an empty bottle of whiskey at his side. His obituary made no mention of children. Edmund Yancey left Greenbrier soon after. He opened a small store in Charlottesville and lived a quiet life. But his journal, discovered after his death in 1881, told everything: the cruelty, the silence, the night of escape. His final entry, written just 3 days before his death, read, "I have spent 34 years trying to forget that plantation. Every night I see her face in the river, and I wake grateful she got away, even if getting away meant drowning. Some prisons are worse than death. She knew that. I hope her daughters did too. No one ever confirmed what happened to those 9 daughters. No bounty hunter caught them, no newspaper ever mentioned them, but traces appeared in unlikely places. A Methodist minister's letter from 1848 describing 9 unusually tall women sheltered at a Quaker safe house in Pennsylvania. A teacher's diary from Ontario in 1852, recalling 9 sisters who rarely spoke and refused to share their past. An 1867 census from Michigan listing a family of 9 women, their names smudged by water damage, but one entry legible: Sarah D., age 35. Coincidence? Or proof that the silent giant's daughters lived on? History offers no answer. What we do know is that Greenbrier Plantation never recovered. It changed hands 3 times in 15 years. Workers refused to stay. People claimed to hear voices, to see markings, 9 vertical scratches carved into cabin walls, repeating endlessly. By the Civil War, the place was abandoned. It burned in 1864, though no one knows who set the fire. Today, the land is an overgrown field. A small historical marker notes the plantation's name, but says nothing about Sarah or her 9 daughters. Yet along the James River, 3 miles downstream, a sandbar appears each summer during low water. Visitors sometimes find small piles of stones arranged in groups of 9. Teenagers knock them over, but the next summer they always return. No one knows who builds them. Maybe no one ever will. In 1908, a woman named Clara Pemberton donated her father's papers to the Virginia Historical Society. Among them was a single surviving fragment of Sarah's testimony, hidden away for decades by the courthouse clerk Josiah Pitton, the same man who had witnessed its destruction. In that fragile piece of paper, her final recorded words were written in the hand of a Union scribe. Words are what they use to lie. I had no words left that were not twisted, so I saved my silence like a knife, sharp and clean, until the moment I could use it to cut us free. My daughters learned that survival is not submission, that waiting is not surrender, and that a woman who does not speak may still be planning how to burn the world that tried to break her. This story reminds us that the darkest truths in American history are often the ones we try hardest to forget. But silence protects only the guilty. So what do you believe? Did Sarah and her daughters find freedom, or did they vanish into legend, their story carried only by the river that took them? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this tale with someone who believes history still whispers beneath the surface. See you in the next video.